Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for International Careers Week. I am so excited to introduce Dan Finch. Dan has joined the Milky Way Incorporated and also known as TMW International Incorporated in 2003 and has served as the vice president since 2005. He has built their export and import portfolio and works with clients and suppliers in over 25 countries, providing dairy ingredients and market information to food and animal feed manufacturers. Welcome, Dan. It's great to see you. I'm going to take a moment. I just want to thank our sponsors before we really get started: the Arthur M. Blank Foundation, the Longview Foundation, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, and the High Stakes Foundation. So, Dan, welcome to International Careers Week.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
That's wonderful. Well, we're so excited to hear a little bit more about you and about the Milky Way. Will you start by giving us a little bit of an overview?
Yeah, definitely. I was raised in Butte and made my way to Missoula. And of course, when we think of Montana, we think of ranching and beef cattle, but not a lot about dairy. And so, our company was founded over 30 years ago, and it's really a hybrid type of organization because actually what we provide, we do have physical products that we sell to our customers. And as you said in the introduction, they use those to make anything from ice cream to protein drinks and then on the other side, of course, in animal feed. And it changes day to day, which is what I really love about it. It's a market-driven business. And so you sort of have to put all the pieces together. And then my favorite part about the business is it's very old school, meaning it's all about the relationships that you make with both our suppliers and our customers. And so developing those personal relationships and actually providing a product, it really is quite rewarding. So yeah, that's us
That's
in a
great.
very
So
short answer.
how did you get into this line of work?
I would love to say that my mother had something to do with it. She grew up on a dairy farm in Illinois, but she didn't. It was an old school networking contact where the company was located here in Missoula, and in about 2000, they had just started putting their feelers out to try how do we export? What do we do? Um, and my background in both business and actually in mathematics, it was a referral from some folks. And I sat down with the management team and they said, okay, look, here's a blank slate. This is what we think we want to do, but we're not sure how to do it. And so, I jumped into the deep end without any flotation devices. And here we are 20 plus years later.
That's great. So you said you had a little bit of background in business. Did you also have any background in international affairs or in importing, exporting?
Absolutely none. Absolutely none. So it really is, it's interesting. People do ask me that question and they say, how did you get started? Or I think and of course, as I just said, I didn't have that experience. So what were my resources? How was I going to navigate this? And, living in Montana we're so blessed in so many ways. Um, One of the key components is that we have an amazing network of resources in Montana, either at the state level, even the local level, and then of course, we leveraged some of our congressional and senatorial contacts, and just really built the network from the ground up. Because all that you ask for is, who do I need to talk to? That's it, right? Once that door is open, then it just becomes an exercise in expressing what you have to offer.
Mm, I love that. We've heard a lot that it's about relationship building. We've heard that as a common theme this week. from all different industries. In fact, one of our last speaker was just talking about polar bears, and she was saying when you're in a research situation, it's about the relationships, it's about stepping up to the plate, meeting people, and just putting yourself out there. And so it's great to hear that across the board, this seems to be something that is still very, very valued in the business world.
Absolutely. Yep. We don't, no one likes to do anything unknown. And so if you have a support of people and facilities that you trust, then it's no different than what you do on a personal level, right?
Absolutely. So I want to switch gears a little bit and I want to talk about the industry that you're in, and specifically like with Montana. How does dairy impact the global economy and how does Montana play into that?
It's from the local level here in Montana, our dairy infrastructure has shrunk over the years, unfortunately. So we really don't have a lot of processing or even production for that matter. Now, I will say, if we so chose to do that, we could. Idaho, 30 years ago, had a very rudimentary um, dairy infrastructure, and they made the decision that this was something they were going to do, and now they're the third largest dairy producing state in the nation, right? Which is quite extraordinary in that short a time frame. Um, but from an overall, market internationally, dairy itself, the global dairy trade, this year will top $1 trillion, right? This is not something that's insignificant. And we don't
Wow.
think about it because it's just there, right? You you put butter on your toast every day, or right, you pour milk on your cereal. But once you expand that, then it's really quite extraordinary because we're still one of the most economical sources of protein.
Wow. And so what countries or how do countries decide what dairy products to import and export? And how does that work?
Well, it's the old economics mantra of supply and demand. And so if you obviously if you're short, if you can't produce enough, then you're going to look at importing. If you have an excess and there's some value to it, you're going to look at exporting. And dairy specifically, obviously we're challenged from a production side, either primarily geographically or maybe climate, one of the two. And so there are going to be pockets where um, there's a good amount of production and it can feed, literally feed the rest of the world.
That's pretty incredible. Where does the Milky Way or what countries does the Milky Way import, export, do business with?
Okay, yeah. So from an export side, the two largest, not surprisingly, are going to be Canada and Mexico. Canada is very much a challenge, and we can dig a little deeper into some of the challenges. But then, obviously, the Pacific Rim in Asia, that's a huge market, and then South and Central America. We have chosen not to do a lot with mainland China or Africa, but certainly a lot of other products do go there. So yeah, we've exported to places like Korea and Taiwan and Thailand, Malaysia, um, Ecuador, right? Costa Rica, Panama. And then really from an import side, we're going to only bring in those ingredients which make sense, or maybe we have a shortage of. So we import a good deal of goat milk ingredients actually from the Netherlands. And people say, well, why? Don't you have those in the US? Actually, we don't. We don't have that infrastructure, right? Yeah.
That's fascinating. Um, can you tell us a little bit more about the products that you are exporting?
Yeah. So primarily, our focus when we export is going to be something that's more shelf stable. So we don't export fluid milk. Again, there are others that may do that. We do a bit of butter and bulk cheese, but primarily what we export are powdered forms of milk. So, some people might be aware of non-fat dry milk, which, years ago used to come in a box. Sometimes still do. People here in the US don't use it extensively, but you might use it for baking. But non-fat dry milk or whole milk powder, again, most of these are going to be powder. They're going to go to places that then rehydrate, and essentially you take the components of milk that are dried and then you add water back, and then poof, you have milk again, right? Because milk is 90% water.
Yep.
So that's one side. There'll be milk powders, and from the other side, we have whey products. So whey protein, obviously, big in sports nutrition, and now with the growth of Ozempic and things like that, right? People are aware that they need to have better protein in their diet. So the whey, which comes from manufacturing cheese, has its own great source of amino acids and protein that can be used very efficiently by humans.
Wow. Do you produce these products in Montana?
We don't because there's not enough production.
Yeah.
So we, from a commodity standpoint, we will contract with producers, and then from a value added standpoint, we will procure the raw ingredients, either raw milk or raw whey, and we'll then have those produced.
Oh, that's okay. That makes sense. That makes
Yeah.
sense. And where in the world does your job take you? Do you get to go and build relationships with people across or around the world?
I do, yeah. And ironically, I have a friend who has maintained for many years that I actually am not in the dairy business, that maybe I work for the CIA because I'm traveling all over the world, and they say, what are you doing? So yeah, one of the first places that I started 6 months in, I took a trip to Taiwan, and the state of Montana actually has an employee who helps facilitate um, trade and tourism in Taiwan, and it was wonderful because she was able to introduce me to people who were interested, and I could sit down and have tea across the table and have a discussion about what we do. So yeah, typically a couple times a year I'll either be in Asia, or I'll split it up and I'll go to South or Central America, and then generally I'll be in Europe once a year.
Oh, that's pretty incredible. Are there any memorable stories from your we like always love to ask from your travels abroad that you would be willing to share, whether it was a cultural moment, having something that you absolutely loved to eat or would never ever want to eat again?
I I
Give us a little insight into
Okay,
what that
my
looks like.
my best story that really crosses the bridge of how even though we're in different places in the world, we're all just the same people. I checked into a hotel in Vietnam on a Saturday evening, and I usually try not to travel on the weekends, but I was there, and the person at the desk said, "Well, what are you doing tomorrow?" And I said, I actually have the whole day free. It would be great if I could, to tell me what I should see in the city." And they said, "Well, I'll tell you what. I have tomorrow free. Would you like a tour?" And I said, "Sure." And they said, "Do you like motorcycles?" And I said, "Well, I actually have a motorcycle. Yeah, that would be great. Let's go do that." And they said, "Okay, we'll pick you up in the morning." So 10 o'clock in the morning, I walk outside the hotel, and this person has two helmets, and they hand me one. And this is not a motorcycle. This is a moped, right?
Oh,
And I climb on the back, and they're driving, giving me a tour. And so just imagine me, right? It's the version of Dumb and Dumber, where I'm on the back of the moped. And but the entire day we toured the city, and in the evening they said, "Well, would you like to go back to the hotel?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Actually, we would like to invite you to dinner." So I went to dinner at their home, and so again, on a personal level, that was the most amazing trip I had ever taken, because someone who didn't know me just welcomed me with open arms. It was really quite extraordinary.
that's wonderful. Again, I think it goes back to some of that relationship building that you were talking about earlier. You never know when there's an opportunity to say yes and to build a relationship with somebody. And
Exactly. Exactly.
oh, that's great, Dan. Thank you for sharing that story. So, all right, we're gonna change gears again, a little bit more serious.
Yeah.
How do factors like tariffs and trade agreements affect the dairy exports and imports?
That and so timely for what's happening this week with tariffs. Dairy is actually one of the most highly regulated uh, we classify everything with what, people can look into this, but harmonized tariff code. So every single item in the world has a number associated with it. Chapter 4 is dairy, and people get very protective of their market. And so I mentioned Canada, for instance. Canada is extraordinarily protective of their dairy. And part of the discussions in the last USMCA were specifically over dairy. So that is a huge challenge. It's very difficult for US companies to export into Canada or, for instance, into Europe. They're also very protective. Now, on the flip side, you ask about trade agreements. Okay. Trade agreements can be extraordinarily beneficial if you have them in place. And if you don't, then you're fighting them. So, for instance, China is one of the world's largest importers of dairy ingredients. They have a free trade agreement with New Zealand, which means New Zealand ingredients can enter China with basically a lower duty. So we can't compete against some of those ingredients into China. So, from where I sit, I'm obviously a big fan of free trade agreements.
I can imagine. What role does technology and innovation play in the dairy trade industry?
Yeah, this has been an interesting move in the last 20 years, which doesn't sound like that long, but honestly, when I started, there were still people who were faxing things and didn't have emails. It was just all over the phone. It is transitioned now, and let's start on the farm level. There are automated milking machines, and the cows are diagnosed every day for what kind of rations they should get. Should they get a little more protein? Should they get a little bit more fat? So we, as a country, for instance, we haven't grown in terms of the number of cows that we have, but our production's been able to increase just because of those efficiencies, all based on technology. And on the flip side, what we're seeing from a business to business side is there are futures traded on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Those have been new in the last 20 years. So people can hedge what they are doing to protect, their overall budget. And then from an international standpoint, there are a couple global dairy trade, ironically. That's an online platform where buyers in every single country can go and you can buy and sell ingredients, and that happens twice a month. So something that would have never happened even 10 years ago.
Wow. What are the advantages to, I'm going to go with your product, but to Montana dairy, to
Hmm.
US dairy, on the international market? I know in talking with some Montana agriculture folks that
Hmm.
like, our lentils and legumes have a very high level of protein, which is very desirable. So what are some of the things that make
Yeah, it's
Milky
interesting.
Way shine?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. And I will paint this really as the entire US dairy industry, not just us. I mean, I'm a small part of it, but the advantage of the US has is it starts with our food safety laws, which are the most stringent in the world. And so the quality of the products that we produce are second to none. So we don't have to worry about things like salmonella or E. coli or some of these other crazy bacterias, which obviously affect a human. And a good portion of dairy products that are produced and traded on a powder side, they're used in infant formula. So if we're going to be feeding something to our babies, we have to make sure that the quality is there. And luckily, the entire dairy industry knows that and does everything they can to protect that. Um, there are other things like we've seen in the news, the cost of eggs, right? Because of the bird flu. And so the dairy industry is no different if cows are sick. So we protect our herds against things like hoof and mouth. There was just an outbreak of that in Germany, which is kind of crazy to think about. But look, we haven't had one in 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah. So that is a huge plus. And I think that speaks a little bit to the regulation of some of our industries, that it actually on the global market can be a really positive thing.
that's absolutely correct. And we're also lucky it's down at the farm level as well. But people can look back if they hear this, but research um, the melamine scandal in China in 2008, where farmers were adding melamine to their milk to artificially boost the protein, and what they didn't realize was that melamine's a poison. Right. So people actually died from that. And so, this is something we don't have to worry about here.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
hmm, that's terrifying actually to
absolutely.
think.
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Oh wow. So how does the international dairy trade affect farmers and businesses in the US? Is it a
Yeah, well, and I'll go back to that dollar amount that I threw out, right? $1 trillion, and I think the U.S. Just this year, just into Mexico and Canada, our two closest trading partners, right? Will be over 1.4 billion just in that. So work that back onto the farm level. We have seen the prices paid. So the dairy farmers, they are paid uh, by the amount of milk that they produce, but also the quality of the milk. So you'll get extra money if your milk has more protein or more fat. This year, we are seeing almost a 10% higher price paid to the farmers for the milk.
Hmm,
So there you go. There's a direct resource, and that trickles all the way down to, um, some of us in Montana, you'll look at our company name and say Milky Way, and they say, "Hey, I've seen your trucks." Okay, no, that's a different company, but they're tankers of milk going up and down the highway. And if those farmers aren't making money, then truckers not, right? And
yep.
on down the line, on down the line.
It's pretty integral to the economy.
Right.
Absolutely.
And again, very hidden, right? I think agriculture in general, people, uh, you see it in the grocery store and you don't pay attention to where it comes from. So,
Yep.
yeah.
Yes. Yes. Are there any products on the shelves that we would buy that come from you guys, that are specific to you guys, that are in Montana?
So I can't tell you who our customers are, but
Ah, because
what
you're not actually making your, got it. You're sort of the middleman there.
I'm supplying an ingredient, right?
Yep.
So, but I will tell you there are some ice creams, some local ice creams which are made from ingredients that we supply. There are some local whey protein mixes,
Yep.
right? We do supply some ingredients locally to some of the bulk stores. So you can go
Mhm.
to the store, and if you wanted some whey protein, you'll see our name on it, and you can dig yourself out scoops, and it's entirely pure, 100% pure. There's no flavors or additives add. If somebody wants to do that, we leave it to them.
That's great. How would you recommend serving the whey or mixing the whey to make something?
Yeah,
What's your favorite whey
it,
recipe? We're getting into recipes
yeah,
now.
that's right. If you like ice cream, putting it in ice cream is the best. But I prefer a little bit of vanilla Greek yogurt and put it in the blender with a couple pieces of ice cubes, and that's it. So, but I'm pretty simple.
Yeah, I was gonna say that sounds pretty simple, pretty
Yeah,
easy.
yeah,
Great.
and a little decadent too. So,
Yeah, that Greek yogurt is pretty delicious.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
oh my goodness. So what kind of education or skills are needed for a career in international agriculture, or really the dairy trade? Where would we start?
Yeah, let's go two levels. If you are interested in agriculture, I would highly recommend looking at the what we call food science, okay, where You're able to analyze the building blocks of food, and then you can turn that into application. So if you want to be a mad scientist and you want to say, hey, how can I develop the best whey protein on the market, right? Then there's a route to go. Um, if you are interested in specific in dairy science, there are great programs around the country that just focus on dairy. Um, and then if you're a little more hands-on, those dairy sciences also teach you how to run a production facility. So if you want to run an ice cream plant, right, which is really I visit customers or I visit vendors, and you know, they kind of get all nerdy on me and say, "Hey, look, this is how we're making our non-fat dry milk." And it really does kind of go over my head, but it's just so cool to see how they do this. Um, on a business side, hey, look, it's fairly straightforward. A general business or economics. Of course, my background is in both math and business. So I would always highly recommend that the more math you take, the better, because you never know how it's going to turn out. And the reason is just because of logic. Let's think about things logically. And then, of course, I always recommend um, any foreign language skill is going to be beneficial, right? If I could go back and do it all over again, I would have paid a lot more attention in high school and college to my language courses. But it just gives you a leg up. Every time I go to Europe and I sit down for a dinner and there are people speaking four different languages, I think how lucky they are in order to do that. So yeah, I would recommend that no matter what course you choose to do.
Absolutely. Are there any opportunities for young people to get involved in international trade or agriculture, maybe as just an exploratory path?
Yeah, I would look at there are some online portals in which you can pursue, particularly things like I mentioned on the futures, where you can do exercises and learning how to buy and sell and trade. Because from the base standpoint, if you know how to maneuver on the commodity level, that's really just a fantastic way to go. And then on the farm level, of course, FFA and things like that, right? I would highly recommend.
Mm, that's wonderful. Okay, my last question for you today is what advice would you give to students interested in pursuing a career in agriculture or international trade?
Yeah, and I would say this to anyone, just find something you're passionate and be yourself, because ultimately this is what really connects you to people, and it goes back to what we just started. It's all about personal relationships. So again, the great thing is, from where I sit, is you can be on the farm level, you can be on the production level, you can sit in an office like me, or you can drive the truck, right? Any of those. So
Mhm.
go with where your passion leads you, and you'll find a home.
That's wonderful advice. Thank you so much, Dan. Well, Dan, thank you for taking the time to talk to our Montana students. And I learned a ton about the dairy trade that I had no idea about. So I'm sure that everybody is a little bit more wise in that respect. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you again.
Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of International Careers Week. We're so excited to have Alicia here. Did I say it right? No, I mean, from Polar Bear International. Um, she has degrees in animal biology from Thompson Rivers University and ecology from the University of Alberta, where her thesis focused on polar bears from Western Hudson Bay. She gained hands-on experience with polar bears from multiple fall and spring field seasons in northern Canada and has been heavily involved in tracking Hudson Bay polar bears as well as coexistence efforts. She also spearheads Polar Bear International's Tundra Connections webcast program. We are so excited to learn more about your work and polar bears and what Polar Bears International does. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm so excited to talk to everyone. So should I just dive into kind of how I got into this?
Yes,
works?
please.
Here we go. Okay, thanks everybody. So I did not grow up thinking I would end up working with polar bears, not by a long shot. I grew up in British Columbia. There are no polar bears anywhere near that, but I did love animals from a young age. And when I was around 11 or 12, maybe, I realized that being a wildlife biologist was a real job and something I could get paid to do potentially. So that kind of ignited the passion further. So when I graduated high school, as mentioned, I started a bachelor's degree in science, majoring in animal biology. So I learned a lot about animals and zoology, and I got to do lots of hands-on work. And I also joined a co-op program. So every summer I worked with animals. And I also, as part of that, did an honors project. So I did my own little research project and I assisted other people in their research projects. And I studied things like deer mice, little field mice. I would trap them and tag them and put little radio collars on them. I studied toads and put little radio backpacks on toads and tracked them through the forest. I worked with badgers and all sorts of little things. And I love the little things a lot. And my supervisor for that work, he had back in his day gone to school with Andy DeRoche, who is a very well-known polar bear biologist. So when I got ready to look to the next step and go to graduate school, he said, email Andy. And I thought, oh, there's no way Andy would take me. There's not a chance. So I was looking around at all these other places. And then finally one day I was like, I have nothing to lose. I'll just shoot him an email. And within no time at all, the same day, Andy got back to me and said, sure, I'll take you on a polar bear project. And I thought it was a joke at first. I thought there's no way, but I was a very good student. I'd worked really hard. My grades were good. I'd had a scholarship. And the day I emailed Andy, he had just found out he got funding for a project. And I was the next person to email him. He gets a lot of requests. And I looked good, so he took me because he believes a little bit in serendipity. So it was a bit accidental, a bit of luck and a bit of hard work and knowing people and, making good impressions on people, all these things that kind of accidentally led me into this polar bear project. And through that research there, again, I worked hard, made good connections with the biologists, and I also volunteered for Polar Bears International. And this was working out of Churchill, Manitoba on the coast of Hudson Bay in Canada, that big body of water. So I volunteered with them. I did outreach. I talked to people. I basically did anything to impress them that I could. And then when I graduated with my master's degree, they hired me. Now, Polar Bears International is based in Bozeman, Montana, of all places, which is super cool. So I've been able to visit Montana many times and I love it. And there's a ton of conservation happening in Bozeman and Montana broadly, which is super cool. I do live up in Whitehorse in the Yukon of Canada. So I live in the cold, not with polar bears, but I do travel to go work with polar bears when needed. And then every day, just I'm working from home a lot, but talking to my colleagues all around the world to work with polar bears. And Polar Bears International, they are the only nonprofit in the world who is solely focused on conserving wild polar bears. And we do this through a mixture of research. We do our own research, we fund other research, we do education, we work with media, so the TV and movies, if they want to do things about polar bears, we want to make sure they get the science right, and then advocacy, and that's really kind of speaking up on behalf of something. And for polar bears, they don't have a voice, so we're trying to speak up for them and encourage the world to help us protect them. And so I think we have a short video here. It's just a little sizzle reel of one of the many projects we have going on in Svalbard, Norway, which is very far north. We've been working in Svalbard for many years, and I think it showcases like the wide variety of different types of knowledge and people and backgrounds we need to get a project done.
I don't hear sound. Is there sound?
There's some cool music. It's not critical, but it's nice.
Let's see. We're gonna reshare it.
Thank you.
Hold on, oh wow, now I've really caused a problem. Hold on. Oh dear. Sorry, everybody.
All good.
Okay, here we go. Let's do take two.
Mm-hmm.
Is that better?
Thank you. So you didn't see a polar bear in that video, but you saw the research that goes into seeing the polar bears. A lot of what we do, we don't see polar bears every day. That work specifically, that team, my team, all amazing people, they're going out and they're setting up these remote cameras to capture footage of when moms emerge from their dens with their brand new babies. And we've been running this project for years, so we are collecting all this footage of how families are doing. They're the most vulnerable polar bears in the population. We want to help protect moms and cubs, especially protect moms and cubs. So how are the moms looking? How are the cubs looking? How many cubs are there? Things like that. So it takes a huge team of, there's biologists, there's engineers, there's communicators, there's photographers, there's the guys that created that video. There's all sorts of skill sets there that can support polar bear conservation, and it's pretty cool.
I'm going to start off with questions. So you've mentioned Canada and you mentioned Norway. Is there any other places in the world where you work with polar bears or where we can find polar bears?
Sure. So there's 5 polar bear countries around the world. Canada has the most polar bears, and then Norway, Russia, Greenland, and the United States. So Alaska does share 2 populations of polar bears, one with Canada and one with Russia. So we find them all across the circumpolar north.
Which areas do you think polar bears are in the most need of help to preserve them there?
That's a great question. So there's 20 different populations of polar bears. All polar bears as a species relies on Arctic sea ice to survive. So they all need that. But we can look a little more locally, geographically to see who needs what sooner. So the most southern populations are found in Canada, and that's in that Hudson Bay area that I mentioned. So Canada has some pretty south populations, and so they're experiencing some warming pretty quickly. So we've lost some of them. They're vulnerable right now, so our eyes on them. Alaska populations, there's been quite a few changes in the Beaufort Sea. So there's less ice than there used to be. Many of those polar bears are spending more time on land, so they're quite vulnerable. And then Svalbard, Norway is interesting where that project was because it's warming faster than anywhere else in the entire world. It's warming like almost 8 times faster than anywhere else. Those polar bears are a little more resilient for now. They haven't seen a massive decline yet because they're able to utilize different hunting strategies and they're still okay, but we're also concerned about them. So I'd say those are like the main hotspots right now that we're looking at.
Why would you say that Norway is warming up more than other areas at such a rapid rate?
Yeah, so it's the way it has to do with currents and ocean currents and air currents. It's where it's located in the Arctic and how everything's moving around it. It just happens that that's kind of the warming center of the Arctic. So it just geography and kind of gets into like physics and water cycles. So we've seen a lot of changes there, but again, some of those polar bears choose to spend more time on land and hunt off land, and they have a bit more, few more options built in, so they're not like being impacted as rapidly as you might think.
What would be like 3 really fun facts that we may not know being in Montana about polar bears?
One of my favorite facts is that you might all know this already, but they are the biggest bear species in the world. So they are one of 8 bear species. Polar bears get the biggest. They are also the most, well, they're the most carnivorous, but really what they are, we like to call them lipivores, which we kind of made that up. But so polar bears eat more meat and less fruits and veggies than any other bear, and they have to. Their digestive system has evolved that way. So they cannot have a diet like a brown bear. If they eat too much protein or fruits and veggies, they will, it's hard on their kidneys. It's not good for their body. What they really want and why they're the biggest bear is because of their diet, which is seal blubber. That's their #1 favorite food. If a polar bear is eating a lot of seals, it'll even leave the meat behind. It will just strip off the blubber, and they can eat over 100 pounds of blubber at one sitting and have a really high conversion rate to the blubber they eat, turning it into the fat on their own body. So they really are blubber bears, and I like to call them blubber hunting ice bears because they are tied to the ocean. They're the only marine bear. So that's kind of my third fact. They're the biggest, the most carnivorous or fat eaters, and then they are the only marine bear, the ocean bear. So all the other bears are happy to live on land and forage for berries and roots and insects, and polar bears are like, I'm going to go live out on the frozen ocean and eat blubber, and I'm just going to be that way. And so it makes them very cool, also very hard to study, and an interesting conservation challenge.
Where can you find the most polar bears in the world?
So As a country, Canada has most of the world's polar
yeah.
bears broadly. And then, you know, even if we want to look at like concentration, so it will depend on what time of year you're looking.
Mhm.
Generally, when they're out on the ice, we think they spread out. Again, it's hard to study. We can only really track females right now effectively. Males have necks that are bigger than their head, so they'll pull collars right off. But we do know some of the famous places where polar bears do gather in large groups. Generally, sometimes it has to do with food. So in Alaska, you might have heard of a town called Kaktovik. Historically, so Kaktovik, every year the hunters are able to bring in 1 to 3 bowhead whales, which are huge whales. They'll bring the whales in for subsistence. You know, they're eating them, they're harvesting them. And bears will come in and gather in large concentrations, polar bears, to eat the leftovers. They like that. And then Churchill, Manitoba is actually called the polar bear capital of the world sometimes. There's about, 600 to 800 people that live there. There used to be 1,200 polar bears in the area. Now there's closer to 600, but polar bears come through that town every fall. They gather nearby. There's a big tourist group season there every fall for people come from all over the world to see the polar bears. That's where we spend a lot of time to see the polar bears and study them. So that's definitely one of like the world's polar bear gems is near Churchill, Manitoba.
Amazing. Now, students, if you have questions, please type them into the chat so we can ask them. How else do polar bears differ from bears that we might find here in Montana?
Yeah, so polar bears, one kind of fun fact I think about polar bears. So their closest cousin is the brown bear. They evolved from brown bears or grizzly bears many years ago. And polar bears are, like I mentioned, the biggest and they're so strong, but their bite is a little weaker than grizzly bears. And again, it's all about diet. So grizzly bears have a crunchy diet. So they're grinding roots and all this like hard roughage. And polar bears eat a squishy diet. So they actually don't bite quite as hard as grizzly bears. So you still don't want to get bitten by one. But that's a difference. Polar bears also have quite different feet. So their feet have fur on them, whereas grizzly bears and black bears don't. Their feet also have papillae, so they have like bumpy feet. They have like built-in winter tires, gives them some stickiness. They also have much sharper and thicker claws. I used to have claws somewhere, but grizzly bears have long curved claws, great for digging and living on land. Polar bears very thick and sharp, good for grabbing a seal out of the water and pulling it back up. Polar bears also have hollow fur, which helps trap heat against their body. And it's actually clear. They're not really white. They just look white to us. Their hair is transparent in a microscope.
Amazing. All right, we're getting questions in here from Reed Point. What should one do if they encounter a polar bear in the wild?
That's a good question. So ideally, you're with people because you're not going out into the wild all alone, hopefully. So you stick together. Also, ideally, you have brought, if you know you're going out into the wild in bear country, you've brought some sort of bear deterrent. So it could be a shotgun or it could be bear spray, which is highly effective on polar bears and brown bears through data. It could be a flare, it could be a whistle. Any sort of noise. You want to make noise. You want to say, I'm not food. You want to get your bear spray ready. If it gets close enough, you're going to spray it. You don't run. Try to stay calm. We've also seen, there's one example where a guy got cornered by a polar bear in Churchill, and it was dark outside, and he turned the flashlight on his cell phone, and he waved it in the bear's eyes, and it startled the bear, and he was able to get away. Bears kind of have sensitive eyes. So you're going to not act like food. And even if it's a brown bear, never play dead. There's a bit of a myth about that. You only play dead when you have no other choice. You're going to fight back. You're going to punch its eyes or its nose and just don't act like prey. And hopefully you'll just be fine.
Have negative human bear interactions been on the rise? What is the current trend seen in polar bear news?
This is one of our rising concerns at Polar Bears International, and an increasing part of my job is looking at human polar bear coexistence. We know across the Arctic, polar bears are spending more time on land as their sea ice melts. This leads to the bears being hungrier, being more willing to take risks, going into town, following their noses, getting into garbage, getting into trouble, coming in contact with people. People are also spending more time outside on the land as the world warms up a bit. So one of the things we're working on is getting a better reporting system. We do believe interactions are on the rise. We would like that to be reported a bit better in the data. There have been in Canada in the last 10 years, people have been killed People have been hurt. Bears have been killed. In Alaska several years ago, there was a family, a mom and a was killed. So there are awful things that happen, but generally there's more interactions than there are injuries. So one of the best things that we're doing is just education, like telling people about how they can stay safe with polar bears, giving them tips and tricks how to manage their garbage, how to be outside and stay safe with bears. We're also providing equipment. There's, for example, quite a few communities in northern Canada who never historically saw polar bears, and now they're seeing polar bears come into their towns, and it's a different bear than the ones they're used to. So we're providing bear spray and bear bangers and flares, and we're sending in trainers to help train them on how to scare polar bears away. We've also developed new, safer polar bear traps so they can trap a polar bear and move it out of town. So it will take the global community working together, but education is one of the number one things, particularly when people come up from the South and not even Montana. You guys know something about bears. A lot of people know nothing about bears, and they're going up north and they don't know how to be prepared. So we want to help them prepare.
Ooh, can polar bears ever become pets or can be domesticated at all?
So people have tried. Multiple people have tried. It used to be in Churchill many, many years ago. There, the military actually was there for a bit, and there wasn't great information about polar bears, and there were a lot of them. And people tried to, take cubs and raise them, but man, even little bear cubs get strong fast, and it's so hard to feed a polar bear properly. Zoos kind of have it down, but even zoos, they have to be pretty smart about what they're feeding a bear and keeping them occupied. Doesn't work that great. There is one polar bear. Her name's Aggie. You might have seen her if you've ever seen a commercial that has a polar bear in it, it was probably Aggie. So there was a guy that hand reared Aggie from a little cub. She seemed, she really loved him. He never had issues, but he was really like on top of her training and really well aware. Well, he recently has not been able to take care of her, so she has gone into a captive setting and she's being very well cared for, but she's not super happy. Like, she grew up with a human. She doesn't know how to interact with other polar bears. She's in this weird environment. She's pretty spoiled. It's not really good for her brain development. So I would encourage nobody to ever try to have a pet polar bear.
What made you want this job?
I really liked it. So I feel like I have this kind of best of both worlds. I get to go out in the field, see polar bears. I get to help collect data to help us understand the species better. I get to talk to people about something I'm passionate about, and I get to further conservation globally. So one of my favorite things about polar bears is how they're so connected to humans, even if you don't live near them. So genuinely everything we do globally for polar bears. So say we want to protect sea ice, we want to protect polar bears. That means cutting carbon emissions, voting for leaders that care about our future, things like that. That's all good for people too. Whatever happens to the polar bears is a direct reflection of what's going to happen to us. So it's protecting my child, protecting the next generation means protecting polar bears. It goes together. So I really keeps me going. I like that.
How do you know what gender a polar bear is?
It can be tricky. So there's a few clues. So if you see like a massive bear that has scars, especially if he's got scars, it's probably a male. The males get twice as big as females. So that could be a giveaway. Males also, on the back of their forearms, they have these really long hairs. They're kind of special ones. We think maybe the lady polar bears like it or something. Maybe it's something that they are like, oh, he looks good. So they get these really long hairs there. Females, of course, if they've got a cub, we know it's a female. We can also sometimes look to see if there's a little bit of discoloration either in the front or the back to clue us in on where the bear's peeing from. That might give us a clue, because sometimes a young male might look just like an adult female. And anyway, there's clues, and sometimes we genuinely can't tell at all. And we have to get up close and handle the bear when it's tranquilized and be like, oh, and even scientists still get it wrong. Like, oh, I'm pretty sure that's an adult female. Nope, it's a young male. So it's trickier than it might seem. Yeah, they can look a lot alike.
Are there different government strategies among the Arctic countries in managing polar bears?
Yes, excellent question. All of the countries signed a international agreement on polar bear conservation in 1973. So we do all work together to share data, conserve polar bears in the long term. That's something we've committed to. However, within that, we know all these different countries do things a little bit differently. There's different considerations. For example, Canada allows the harvesting of polar bears under a quota system for Indigenous peoples, which at this point is not a problem. Other countries don't like to do that. Some countries are considering oil drilling, which would negatively impact polar bears. Other countries will not do that. Some countries have different levels of tourism. So there are quite a few differences in how some countries want to manage, themselves, which just can impact polar bears. So that's something we work within, and there's different considerations there. Russia, off and on work with Russia effectively. Right now, a little bit off. So yeah, there's different things going on. It's a diplomatic situation to be in.
Do you feel like biologists like yourself are adequately compensated for the work you do?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I think, biologists, there's a lot of different levels of pay depending on what type of biologist you are. I don't think anyone goes into biology to get rich. In fact, I know no one goes into biology to get rich. If this is the path you choose, you're not thinking you're going to be a millionaire or billionaire one day, but you're doing it for what the job is and you're passionate about it. So right now, I would say I'm adequately compensated. I work for a nonprofit, so I'm not at the top level. Some biologists are making good money if you're working at, the government level or that, but no biologist is getting paid, but we can generally survive for sure and make a decent living and be happy with our choices.
Amazing. All right. I could say as a nonprofit worker too, you do it because you love the mission.
Totally. Yeah.
What's the closest you have ever gotten to a polar bear?
Yeah, I have touched polar bears. I've held cubs. So I did quite a bit of field work in my day. So we go out in a helicopter, we find polar bears, we tranquilize them from the helicopter with a dart gun. We use a very safe drug, so they go to sleep safely. We hop out and we take samples, we measure them. We see how the cubs are doing, how healthy the bears are. We check their teeth, maybe give them an ear tag with a number, all those things. So yeah, I've done. They're not as soft as they look, and they can smell. Sometimes they smell clean if they've been out on the ice. If they've been on land all summer rolling in the dirt, they smell a little bit like a dirty dog. But yeah, it's been pretty neat, and I appreciated that part of the work. They're very big.
Does your job, I can imagine, does your job require you to travel, or do you stay in one location most of the year?
So I do travel. Most of our staff, well, no, not most. Some of our staff needs to travel. So living in the Yukon, I do travel to Churchill at least once a year to see the polar bears and visit with people. Occasionally, I travel to meet with our staff. So our staff is growing and spread out. So sometimes we'll come together meeting. And then I do travel to do some speaking. So I've, given talks in Paris and Berlin and New York and across the states to talk to people about polar bears. And we think that's important. We choose that carefully, whether it's worth the carbon to go talk to this audience about what we do. So I do travel a bit. We're all traveling less after COVID, but I think that's not a bad thing. So we're thoughtful about when we travel, but I do travel a nice amount, not too much, but a little bit to keep it interesting.
How many people work for Polar Bear International?
We have grown quite a bit in the last few years. I think we have roughly 30 staff members now. Maybe half of that is in Bozeman, Montana, and then we've got a few Canadians spread out and a few other Americans, like in Portland, Oregon. We've got someone in Ohio. We had someone in Washington, D.C. So yeah, it's a good mix, about 30. So we're not super big, but we have a good impact because we work really collaboratively with our partners.
Amazing. Are there mutations in polar bears like in people, like dwarfism?
Oh, neat. Not commonly at all, because any often mutations can be negative, and a polar bear really needs to have it would be hard for a polar bear to survive in the wild if it had some sort of mutation that made it harder to hunt. Like being smaller would make it a lot harder to hunt effectively. Um, Polar bears generally look pretty similar. They look a lot more the same compared to like grizzly bears and brown bears. We do know there's been some likely genetic differences in polar bears. So there is a gene some of them have. It's rare, but it makes them a bit more aggressive. But that similar gene is found across wildlife, including in humans. Um, and sometimes the ears look a little funky. I think sometimes some of them have slightly bigger ears, but yeah, it's not super common thing to see. That's a really interesting question.
How tall can a polar bear get?
An adult male polar bear could stand on its hind legs and dunk a basketball just by standing. So they get pretty tall, and on all fours. So I'm like 5'3", 5'4", and an adult male polar bear back would be like it would be pretty high. It might not be taller than me, but it would be like pretty tall. So they get pretty tall.
How do you get close to a polar bear so you can tranquilize it?
So generally we're using a helicopter. So a lot of this work involves helicopter pilots as well. My husband's a helicopter pilot and I met him doing this work. So the pilot has to be very good and understand animal behavior. So we get the researcher on one side of the helicopter with the dart gun, and the helicopter flies and kind of can put the polar bear in a safe spot and then get really low and behind the bear, and then the biologist darts it and then the helicopter peels off and we let the bear fall asleep. So that's usually how we do it. Occasionally, if you're on land, you can also use a dart gun, but you have to be careful it's not too much of an impact. No one ever wants to hurt the bear. That's always number one. Like, we're not here to hurt animals, we're here to protect them. And then if it's a young bear, you can use a stick and have a little needle on a stick if it's like a subadult, which is like the teenager bears, and you can kind of walk up and stick them. Generally, polar bears are not like seeing you and lunging at you and attacking. They're kind of standing their ground, so you've got a bit of leeway. Kind of depends on the situation.
How much time do you spend writing grants, or do you spend most of your time in the field? How are you funded?
Oh, I love it. So field work broadly for polar bears is only a very small portion of anybody's work. So there's a few weeks in the fall and a few weeks in the spring that field work might happen, but generally polar bear seasons are dangerous, extremely expensive, and short and dictated by weather. So even if there's biologists out there that they're like kind of the field work people every year, and even them, they're maybe a few weeks a year total. So a lot of my work is on the computer, and I am on the grants team. So not everyone is, but I do write grants. I'd say I could put aside like a solid day a week to, or even sometimes more, depending on the season, to write and read and review grants and then write reports. Sometimes of the year, maybe like it would take me a couple days. I do luckily enjoy that part. I love kind of like writing the grant story and connecting with the funder for that sort of stuff. We are funded at Polar Bears International by mix, so we don't get government money. We have one government grant in Canada that's very specific, but we don't get any money from the US government or anything, but we do fundraising, so individual donors grant money. So like for example, Disney's given us a grant before, the Bill and Melinda Gates have given us a grant before, things like that. Um, and then corporate sponsorships are a rising one. So we work with the clothing company Canada Goose. We work with Vicks, like if you know the Vapor Rub or the cough drops, they're a great corporate sponsor. So yeah, we cobble the money together and we make it happen. Yeah, that's an interesting part of the work.
Have you ever named a polar bear? If so, what did you name it?
So I personally haven't. When we tag a polar bear, it gets a very official number. And in every country around the world, the bears start with a different letter. So in Canada, it's X. So Canadian polar bears have an X number. So we might see something like, oh, she's X33579. And like that's her science name. But then we do have situations where, for example, Polar Bears International has an online bear tracker. So you can go online and see the bears that are collared right now in Hudson Bay, and you can see where they are right now, and you can watch their tracks all winter. And some of those bears get names. Either our corporate sponsors name them or we name them to kind of just make them more connectable. That's not really a word, but you know what I mean. So sometimes we do give them kind of honorary names. We do also have a couple videos of specific polar bears that we followed over the years. One is Violet in Norway, and one of my favorite ones is Ursula in Hudson Bay. And she's a very cool bear who is still out there having babies.
Amazing. If there was a fight, who would win, a grizzly bear or a polar bear?
Oh, classic question. Generally, the consensus is a grizzly bear. So grizzly bears are a bit more aggressive broadly than polar bears. Part of that is because grizzly bears are land bears who protect territories. So they have this territorial streak. Particularly northern grizzlies are a bit aggressive because there's not a lot of food. So they're protecting this area. They're really hangry. I think they're hangry all the time. There's not a lot of food up there. Then you have polar bears who don't protect any territories because ice is always melting and forming. And when they are eating, when they do have food, they can eat well and store a lot of fat. So grizzly bears are a lot grumpier. Like I mentioned earlier, they've got a bit more of a bite strength. When I mentioned Kaktovik earlier in the whalebone pile, so one thing that's been noted on multiple occasions is that they'll see something like 20 or more polar bears feeding at a whale carcass. And one grizzly bear walks up to that whale carcass and the polar bears just kind of scatter. They don't want to fight. They don't want to get injured. It's not worth it. So probably a grizzly bear would win in most cases.
Why are polar bears a popular common zoo animal?
Hmm. It might go back in time. I'm not sure what was going on with zoos in like the 50s, 60s, 70s. I think probably polar bears seemed really exotic for a lot of places. And so people did take them in from the wild. This was before we really cared about like animal welfare to a great extent. And then they started breeding the polar bears. I will say these days, particularly the United States is a leader in zoo welfare, and the polar bears are very well taken care of. Their genetics and interbreeding and everything is very controlled and on top of mind all the time. Um, the US cannot import any more polar bears into the country, so that's part of why some breeding happens. And in Canada, some bears can come in, like orphans can come in from the wild to zoos, though that's pretty restricted now. And I think for people, yeah, it's just so exotic. Like most people will never get to see a polar bear in their lives, except if it's at a zoo. We think zoos can be incredible ambassadors for the species. If the zoo's taking good care of the bear, if they have good messaging, they can really help people feel connected to the species and want to act on behalf of that species. So we do work with a network of zoos and aquariums. We call them our Arctic Ambassador Centers. And zoos see more visitors every year than like a ton of sporting events combined. Zoos get millions and millions of visitors a year, so they do have a lot of power there to tell stories and connect. So yeah, I think people like seeing polar bears, and as long as it's done properly and thoughtfully, it can be okay.
What zoos do you work with that might be here in the United States?
Ooh, I would have to pull up the list. Quite a few. San Diego's a huge one. Oregon Zoo, Detroit Zoo, Cincinnati, Columbus. We have many on our website, but we have 50 in total, and most of those are United States zoos, and they do an excellent job. Generally, United States is definitely ahead with some of the zoo things.
What is the average IQ of a polar bear?
Oh my goodness. I would not be able to answer that. I don't know if anyone could really answer this. I will say they are very smart, like spooky smart, and they are considered, yeah, as all bears are very smart. Generally the polar bear people think polar bears are some of the smartest. Part of that is their lifestyle. I've been fortunate enough to be out on the Arctic sea ice, and you look around when you're out there and it feels like you're on another planet. It is, well, it's freezing, it's dark, it's cold, it's windy, it's wet. It just looks like a wasteland. It's like, why is anything living out here? Polar bears have to be so intelligent. They're constantly looking around, anything kind of different, they're going toward it, they're seeking things out, they're figuring out ways to hunt. They are incredibly, incredibly intelligent, and that's giving them a little bit of resiliency in some places to, as their climate is warming and world is changing, they can figure some things out because they're just so smart. But they can also be kind of scary smart. Like when they come into communities and get close to people, it's kind of maybe kind of dangerous to be so smart. They'll figure out ways to get food and get around things. So I don't have a real IQ, but I'll tell you they're up there in terms of animal intelligence.
Have you ever had a really strong connection with a polar bear or anyone on your team and then had that polar bear pass away?
Hmm. Yeah, so one example I guess I could give. So it's pretty rare in the wild that we can identify returning polar bears. They all kind of look pretty similar. There's a lot of, in and out polar bears coming, and so it's pretty hard to track year over year. But there was a bear in Churchill, and they named him Dancer because one of the things we have in Churchill is these big tundra buggies. They're like polar bear monster trucks, and they go out on the tundra, and tourists are inside, and polar bears can come right up to the vehicle, so you can look down and see a polar bear very close. And Dancer used to come up to the driver's side of the vehicle and stand up on his hind legs. And then he would back away and kind of like dance and sway as he backed up on his hind legs. And it was quite something. And he had a very distinct scarring pattern. So they knew it was him year by year. And he came again and again and again. And you can still see art about him in Churchill, and people still talk about him. And one year he just didn't come back. So we didn't see him pass away or anything, but he didn't come back. And people felt it, those that had known him really, I mean, they still talk about him. It's been years. So you do feel some sort of connection to these wild creatures. And when they're gone, it's hard, and you wonder what happened, and you're grateful for the time you had with them.
How do you track the polar bears?
Oh, track them? So historically, we've only been able to put GPS collars on, and only on females. I mentioned the males have really thick necks, and they'll just pull collars right off. So we can do adult females, and they have like a battery and a tracker on, and they carry the collar for a year or two, and then the collar falls off naturally, and the collar talks to a satellite and gives us incredible data. There was a big gap in knowledge for males and young bears. We don't want to collar a growing bear and have it like grow out of the collar. So we actually are my colleague in Montana. He worked with his dad, who was an engineer at 3M, and 3M got behind a project to make fur tags. So we called it our Burr on Fur project, and 3M helped us develop a fur tag for polar bears so that we could put a fur tag on any bear, on males, on subadults, on even cubs. And we tested them in zoos. This is another way zoos can help. They helped us test this technology and then deployed these fur tags in the wild. So now we know they work to some extent, so we can put out trackers on other bears. They don't last as long. There's also been some ear tracker tags put in some males. The thing there is that those don't fall out naturally, but they still can give us some good data. So it really, we need this technology to work, and technology does not like cold, salty water or ice or wind or big bears rolling on it. So it's hard to get the technology just right and expensive. And there's not a lot of people that want to invest in wildlife technology because there's not a lot of money in it. So we don't get these like big fancy tech guys helping us that often with stuff because they're not going to get a great return. So if we can maybe pull on some heartstrings, that would maybe help us get ahead.
Can polar bears get a connection with people if they knew them since they were born?
Yeah, I think we absolutely see that in the zoo situation would be how we would see that. So if a polar bear is born in a zoo and is hand raised for any reason, and then over time grows up with those people, it can absolutely have some sort of connection. I was just at the Oregon Zoo recently, and one of their bears has a very strong connection with one of their divers who goes into the and cleans, and apparently like they're all joking about it, like she just loves him when he's around. She'll listen to him more than anyone. She'll track him, follow him. She just really feels a connection there. So it absolutely happens, just like people, we connect with certain people and animals. Polar bears, same thing, they have their feelings.
Have you ever had a polar bear be aggressive towards you or someone at Polar Bear International?
I've been pretty lucky myself. I had like one instance where I was able to get the polar bear scared away. We did have a couple of our team members. They were working out. It's called Cape Churchill. It's outside of Churchill. They were working on a tower, and there was a male polar bear that kept coming in and kept coming in and was like causing some problems. And they kept trying to scare this bear away. And they would use bangers and crackers, and so like these loud banging sounds, and the bear would go a little bit away, and then it would come right back, and then it would get scared a little bit away and come right back. And it got to the point, it got so close to them, it was really trying to get at them at that point. So they did bear spray that bear, and the bear spray worked. The bear took off. But at that point, first of all, they kind of got some bear spray on their pants, which is super itchy. Giving a thumbs up there. And second of all, once you spray bear spray, some of you might know this, but it then becomes an attractant. So it's very useful in the moment. It'll scare the bear away, but then you got to get out of there because now it smells interesting and might bring more bears in or that same bear later. So they had to kind of wrap up soon after that. But it does happen occasionally, and you don't know which bear is going to be a trouble bear that day. Well, it's not a trouble bear, an overly curious bear. So you do have to be careful and always work with team members to stay safe.
Polar bears colorblind? Can they only see certain colors?
We think, so they have eyes that are very similar to dogs in that I'm gonna get this wrong because it's been forever, but they're like missing a cone or something. Anyway, we think they're red-green colorblind. They generally we think can see like blues and yellows, but red-green we don't think they can see effectively. I don't know if there's been any amazing data on that though.
And then my last question for you is what advice would you give to students who are thinking about what they want to do when they grow up, or any advice if they want to go into biology or wildlife conservation?
Sure. I would say keep as many doors open as you can. Make good impressions, work hard and do the dishes. And this is kind of a funny one, but this is something that has come up in so many field camps I've been in, is that you're working as a team. No matter what you're doing, you're in a team. And if everyone's eating and then after you're willing to get up and help with dishes and clean up, that really matters because we work with people. I'll tell you, we work with a lot of people that they'll be with us for weeks and not once have they chipped into the grunt work. And it's just not good teamwork and they're not invited back. And that's happened to multiple people that they don't get invited to come back. And dishes is kind of a metaphor, right? It's not actually the dishes, but it's just being a good teammate. It's being willing to support your team, to work hard, to do the non-glamorous stuff, and then you get more opportunities to do the glamorous stuff. And I really love doing my co-op program. That might not be an option everywhere, but anytime you have the chance to get hands-on, to meet people, to kind of push yourself and do things that you want to learn, even if you're a bit uncomfortable at first, it's really helpful. It kind of teaches you about what you like. It can open some doors for you. Options are always good and try to like grades do matter to some extent. They're not everything, but like try to, do okay because it just opens doors for scholarships and money and things like that. But you don't need to be like a straight A student, but working hard and a good attitude go a long way.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on our third annual International Careers Week. We're so thankful. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And students, thank you so much for joining us again. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.